Hello, this is FlippedHarber for Algebra 2. In this video we're going to talk about inverses of relations and functions. Our objectives for this lesson are to graph and recognize inverses of relations and functions, and to look at how to find inverses of functions. The outline for this video will talk about inverses. We'll look at graphing a relation and its inverse. We'll talk about inverse functions. And we'll find inverses of functions by using opposite operations and by a method where we switch the x and y. So you already know a lot of inverse operations. You know that the inverse of addition is subtraction. The inverse of multiplication is division. Getting a little more complicated, the inverse of squaring a number or a variable is the square root. So really an inverse undoes something in math. For every mathematical operation, there's an inverse that undoes it. Well, we want to be able to apply this idea of inverses to relations and functions as well. So let's take a look at graphing a relation, so basically just a table of data, and we'll take a look at how to find its inverse and we'll graph it as well. So I've got some data, x, y. I'm going to go ahead and plot those points, and I drew the curve for it as well. Now the inverse, really quite simply, I take all of the y values, make them the x values, take all the x values, make them the y values. Pretty straightforward. Just flip the two rows in our data. Now if I go ahead and plot these points and draw the curve, this is what they look like. Now those two curves, those two relations, look very, very similar. Well, as a matter of fact, they are a reflection over the y equals x line. So this is kind of a defining characteristic. The inverse of a point is a reflection over the y equals x line. The inverse of a curve is the reflection over the y equals x line. So that's how we identify graphically inverses. Is it a reflection over the y equals x line? All right, let's talk about inverse functions. Now, a function is an operation or several operations that we can do on numbers, those input values or those x values that we like to talk about, and we get out, sometimes usually a different number. So let's just talk about some generic function where when we plug in 4, we get out 3. The inverse of that function, when I plug in 3, I will get out 4. So it, again, undoes what the original function did. We denote an inverse with this -1 in the power location. Now, this is not 1 over f of x. This is using the -1 for a very different reason. Okay, f inverse of x does not mean 1 over f of x. Okay, it's not that simple. Don't think it is. It's actually read f inverse or the inverse of f. So when you see this -1 power on a function, it's f inverse. It is not 1 over f. Okay. So let's find some inverse functions by just applying the opposite operations that are going on. We already know what the opposite of the 4 basic mathematical operations are. So f of x equals 3x. Well, we're multiplying the variable by 3, so the opposite of that would be dividing by 3. So the inverse of f, or f inverse of x, is equal to x divided by 3. It's going to undo the multiplication that happens in f of x. G of x is equal to x plus 2. So in order to undo that, we just have to use the inverse operation. G inverse, or the inverse of g, is equal to x minus 2. Now h of x is going to be a little bit harder here because not only do we have to think about the opposite operation, we're going to divide, we're going to subtract, but which one should we do first and which one should we do second? It should be in the exact opposite order. So in h of x, when we plug in a number, we multiply by 3 first, then we add 2. We need to do that in the opposite order when we find the inverse. So the inverse of h is equal to x minus 2 all divided by 3. So we want to do the subtraction first and then the division. Now that may not seem real obvious, so let's take a look at a different way of doing this. When we have a function that we want to find the inverse of, we have f of x equals 4 times the quantity x minus 2. I want to find the inverse function for this. First thing I'm going to do is go ahead and replace that f of x with y. So y equals 4 times the quantity x minus 2. And now here's the work to find the inverse function. The first thing we do is we switch the x and the y. Just switch them. Don't do any thinking about this. If it was a y, change it to an x. If it was an x, change it to a y. And now when I solve for this y, what I'm going to have is the inverse of this function. So the first thing I'm going to do is divide by 4. Now add over the 2, and I have x over 4 plus 2 is equal to y, but what this is right here is the inverse function. So f inverse is equal to x over 4 plus 2. Okay, so time for you to try some of these on your own. I'll see you in class and I'll see you online.